In our past lesson about lifecycle methods, we talked about a lifecycle method called componentDidMount. I want you to take a second and see if you can remember what componentDidMount does. ComponentDidMount is like a hook in our React component that allows us to run some kind of code immediately after the component first mounts to the DOM. I mentioned when we were talking about lifecycle methods that one of the most common uses for componentDidMount is to get data from somewhere so that your component can do what it's supposed to do. As a quick refresher, I can add a lifecycle method right here as a class method. It has to be spelled correctly though. It has to be componentDidMount. And let's just take a look. If I do a quick console log, see that it ran our console log, and it ran the console log immediately after the component finished mounting to the DOM. Well, like I said, right here is where we would get any kind of data that's required for this component to display what it needs to display or do what it needs to do. And so for this lesson, we're going to be using a couple tools that are really helpful for doing that. The first one is a built-in JavaScript tool that's more or less new called Fetch. And Fetch is a nice, easy, promise-based way to perform HTTP requests so that we can get any kind of data that we need. I'll put up near the top here a link to the MDN docs on the global fetch function. Another tool we're going to use is an API called the Star Wars API. At vSchool, we really like the Star Wars API because it is CORS enabled, which means that there are no issues with our front-end application getting data from their database. You can find the home page for the Star Wars API right here. Pretty easy to use, and the data that comes back is pretty fun to play with. So feel free to take a look at that website too. And another resource that I figured I would add here is a Medium article that talks about promises, just in case you aren't feeling as familiar with promises as maybe you should. The truth is there's a million articles out there about promises, so you may have to read through a few of them and just practice them yourself until you feel comfortable with them. Okay, so let's get started with this. Inside of my componentDidMount, I'm going to use fetch, which I use by just typing fetch, and this is a global function, so this should just work. And here I'm going to put in the URL where I'm going to be getting the data from. So I'm going to put in the Star Wars API endpoint here, and we're going to search for /people, and we'll just get the person with the ID of 1, which happens to be Luke Skywalker. And that's all we need to do to use fetch to get some data for us. And I'm going to resolve the promise by using a .then, which will receive a response that is not quite yet in the format that we need it to be in. So I'm going to use a method called .json, which will turn this into a JavaScript object for us. And next in my promise chain, I can chain on another .then, which will actually receive the data that we want. At this point, I like to do something just like console log the data so I can see if that worked. We'll refresh this. And it looks like we got some data down there. It's an object with some properties, like a name property, which we see as Luke Skywalker, and some other properties that describe Luke Skywalker. Now that I have some data, I need to get this to display on the screen somehow. I want you to pause the video and just try thinking through what that would entail. How are we going to get this data that we just received from our fetch call to actually show up inside of our browser? Well, now that my component has received the data, if I don't save it somewhere, it's going to disappear. And if you remember, the way that we save data within a component is by its state. So right here in state, I'm going to add something like character maybe, and set it equal to an empty object. I chose an object because I know the data that's going to come in is going to be an object. And then right here where I'm receiving my data, I want to make sure that I save it in my state. So I'm going to set state. Pause the video again and see if you can write the set state that we're going to need to do in order to save this data to our component state. Anytime we want to change the state, we're going to call this dot set state. In this case, I really don't care what the previous state was because I just want to change this dot state dot character to be the data that I just received. So I'm going to provide an object here. Say character is the data that I got. Now, unless I'm inspecting this with my dev tools, I don't currently have a way to show that this is actually working. So down here in our render, I'm just going to choose one of the properties, probably name, and see if that will show up on the screen. So inside of my curly braces, I'll say this dot state dot character dot name. Let's refresh the page and see what happens. Okay, now this API call is fairly quick. It made the call, waited for a response, got the response, set the state, and then displayed Luke Skywalker on the screen all pretty quickly. But if the person using this app has a really slow internet connection, or the API is really bogged down, or for whatever reason it's taking a long time for this request to complete, there's actually going to be nothing that shows up on the page until that request is done, which is a little bit off-putting for a user. So although this doesn't directly relate to this lesson, fetching data from an API, this is a great place to talk about having some kind of loading message that lets the user know that the data is on its way. Now, usually I like to use some kind of fancy loading spinner or something like that, but for now, let's just make it display the word loading until that data comes back. And this will illustrate a little bit of the power of saving state in your component and updating state as you go. So a really simple way to do this is to add to my state a Boolean as to whether or not we're loading. I'll start by saying it's false. And then right before we perform our fetch, I'm going to change it to true. Pause the video and see if you can figure out how to change loading to true. Okay, remember anytime we want to change state, we're going to use set state. And I don't care, again, what the old state was. I'm just going to provide an object and say loading is true. Now what we need to do is figure out how to display the word loading if state says that the data is loading. Pause the video again and see if you can write something down inside our div that shows the word loading if this.state.loading is true. So right now I have this.state.character.name here, but you can see really quickly when I load this that there's a moment where it's blank. So what I could do is right before my return, I could say something like text equal to, and then provide an if-else statement, or I could shorten that by putting a ternary statement here. So I'm going to say, essentially, is this.state.loading true? If so, I want the text to say loading. Otherwise, I want the text to say this.state.character.name. And instead of having this down here, I can put in my paragraph or whatever element of text I want. And I'll say text. Okay, before I refresh this, I want you to try and think like the computer and see if you can figure out what's going to happen. So let me refresh this. And what's going on here? It says that it's loading constantly. So think for a second, why would it be doing that? Why is it consistently saying loading rather than changing it to the character's name? Well, up here, we set loading to true, but we never again set loading to false. And so this is always evaluating to the string loading. So now pause again and see if you can figure out how to fix this bug. This one's pretty easy. Here, when we're setting state of the character, we're also going to set the state of loading back to false. Let's refresh. You'll see it said loading for just a short amount of time, and then it resolved to Luke Skywalker. Awesome. Okay, so we have successfully used componentDidMount as a place to fetch our data from an external API so that our component can do what it's supposed to do. In theory, this component's job is to display one of the characters from the Star Wars API, and it needed the data from the Star Wars API to do that. We've also implemented a loading feature that lets the user know whether it's currently loading or not, so that they don't just give up on our site and leave. I also think this is a good time to take a step back and remember how awesome it is that React is so declarative. If you were doing this with vanilla JavaScript or jQuery or something more imperative, rather than simply having a ternary that checks the current state of your loading variable and deciding whether it should display loading or not, and then just say whatever that is, display the text. Instead, you would have to manually get an element by its ID, change it to loading, start the API request. When the data came in, you would have to get the element by its ID again. You would have to change some other kind of style. You'd have to change the word to display the data that just came in. Whereas here, we simply get to be more declarative and deal with state and say whether we're loading or not, tell it when to say that it is loading, tell it when to say that it is no longer loading, and React will handle the rest. So this is pretty cool, but it does require a completely different way to think about web development. Take a few minutes to play with this code. Feel free to go check out the Star Wars API and try getting some other resources. See if you can get different things to show up on the screen. And when you're ready, let's go to the next lesson.